What is going on, everyone? Welcome to the Believe in Bears podcast. It is your host, Sky Ditka Cruz, and today I have a guest joining me, Cooper Perkins. He is all things USC with the Believe Network. But Cooper, before we get into things, why don't you take some time just to introduce yourself and tell the people where they can find you on social media?
Yes, Guy, it's a pleasure. Thanks for having me on, man. Always happy to talk anything USC and anything related to USC somehow. I went to USC back 2013 to 16, and since then I've been bouncing around the country as a professional sports broadcaster. So most of my work is in play-by-play, also hosting some podcast stuff on the side. You can find me at Cooper Perkins TV on any social platform, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, whatever you're into, you can find me there. And engage with me, ask me questions, tell me that you like stuff, you don't like it, and we'll have a good time together.
Yeah, Cooper's the man. But, as you know, the Chicago Bears, we hold the number one overall pick. Soon to be Caleb Williams, we all assume. But I just want to know, how did the dynamic of the program change when Lincoln Riley and Caleb Williams came to town?
I don't think you can put it in clear enough terms that it was program changing at the deepest level, because people outside of USC circles and definitely outside of West Coast football circles probably don't realize or respect just how far the program had fallen. The sanction years post Pete Carroll turned things into really a wasteland of football for a better part of 10 years. And there was a lack of commitment on the part of the university, and there was a lack of ability at the top of the football program to be able to compete. I mean, you look at Lane Kiffin, Steve Sarkisian, and then Clay Helton. It was just kind of this laundry list that developed of coaches who, while some of them, i.e. Lane and Steve, have gone on to develop into very good coaches, either weren't ready for the job at that time, or in Clay Helton's case, just simply didn't have the tools to succeed. So going out and getting Lincoln Riley was a massive statement that the university wanted to compete again. And him bringing Caleb with him is the kind of thing that you could only dream of as a fan, because it is the pivot point, right? What's the most important position on the football field? It's the quarterback. And they went from having no serious prospects at the position to having arguably the best college football quarterback at that time before he'd won a Heisman Trophy. And overnight, things completely changed. I mean, from just a fan interest standpoint, it couldn't have been bigger, but just on the field, it was the linchpin. I don't think that USC football is continuing to grow in the way that it is without Caleb following Lincoln Riley. I don't think you can give the young man enough credit for what he meant to the program and the turnaround that they made in year one. Yeah, they took a step back in year two, but year one, they don't win 11 games without Caleb Williams. They probably don't win 6 games without Caleb Williams. So I don't think that you can really blow out of proportion just how massive it was for USC. And I think we'll talk more about Caleb throughout this conversation, but I hold him in the highest regard because he is a special player in ways that I don't think most people in the national media give him credit for. We'll talk about his skills specifically, but there are some qualities that Caleb Williams has that are truly unique. And as Trojan fans, we've gotten to see them up close for 2 years.
Exactly. And before we get into Caleb Williams, I want to touch on Lincoln Riley a little bit. What is it about him that makes him so good at developing quarterbacks? Because, in my opinion, he's one of the last few true quarterback whisperers. I mean, he's worked with guys like Jalen Hurts, Kyler Murray, Baker Mayfield, who all went into the NFL and did good things. So I want to know, what is it about him specifically that makes him so good at developing quarterbacks?
I think what Lincoln has going for him that not a lot of other coaches do is that he's a very, very good communicator above all else. So he understands the ins and outs of the position, and he understands how he wants those skills to be applied to his offense specifically. But that's not unique among coaches. I think a lot of coaches have the vision and have the idea of what quarterbacks should be doing, what mechanics look like, all of those things. But Lincoln's a really good communicator. And this goes for both with his players and with fans, with people in the university. He does a very good job communicating his vision for what he wants to see happen, how he sees it developing. And I think that relationship he's been able to build with quarterbacks consistently, right, one after another, reinforces his ability to communicate a message and make things digestible for different kinds of players. I think the one thing that he does as well that really is kind of unique is he changes his philosophy to meet his quarterback's talents. So I think there are a lot of systems where coaches have an idea of what they want their system to look like and try and find quarterbacks who fit the system. Lincoln Riley does things in the inverse. He has an idea of what talent looks like at the quarterback position, and he molds his offense around those skills to optimize what his players can do. I think that's why you see a different offense with Jalen Hurts as opposed to Baker Mayfield, as opposed to Caleb Williams. It really is a dynamic system that depends on who is running it.
Yeah, and I think that's the biggest thing as far as going with calling a good offense. I mean, that's something the Bears have needed for a while. An offensive coordinator that can mold their system around their players and not force their players to work that system. So I think that's great. But time of the hour, we have to talk about Caleb Williams. Is the hype real? Because he's getting some crazy comparisons coming into the league. They're putting him on the same tier of prospects as far as like Andrew Luck, John Elway, all those big time guys. And they're even comparing him to pretty much the GOAT right now, Patrick Mahomes. Do you think those comparisons are worthy? And do you think he could come into an NFL franchise like the Bears and really take over?
I think that there are a lot of reasons that those comparisons have developed. And I think most of those reasons are fair. You look at like the John Elway comparison. Caleb Williams has an arm that would be comparable to John Elway. You think about Andrew Luck, kind of the cerebral qualities, the ability to maneuver an offense. Caleb does have those things. And you think about the off-script capabilities of Patrick Mahomes, and that might be Caleb's best strength. I think, though, that he's being put in a really tough position because of those comparisons. And the one thing that I think is different about him, especially than like an Andrew Luck or a Patrick Mahomes, is how much he's had to overcome in his college career and how much pressure there was on him to perform. Yeah, at Texas Tech, there was some of that with Patrick Mahomes, but that offensive system was also designed to consistently put up points regardless of who's playing offensive line, right? That's a quick, get the ball out of your hand system. There's not a lot of slow developing plays in what Cliff Kingsbury does. Lincoln Riley's a little bit different. There does need to be a symbiosis between the offensive line and the quarterback. And I think Caleb at his best absolutely deserves the comparisons with those guys. But the one area that he needs to be careful about is taking too much responsibility, because there are times, certainly in his college career, particularly in his final season at USC, where you could visibly see that he felt like the play was only going to happen if he made it happen. There wasn't the faith, there wasn't the trust in the system and the players around him to be able to navigate a 10-play, 80-yard drive, whereas he's trying to get things in a 75-yard chunk. But in summation, I do think that those comparisons are apt because he does things naturally that are unteachable. And when you think about those three prospects specifically, they all have qualities about them that are unteachable. So when you look at it from that vantage point of what does Caleb Williams have that you under no circumstances could teach a quarterback in a classroom with any amount of film or development, I think he does belong in that same class, because whether he develops into that or not, we'll have to wait and see. But the tools are certainly there. I think all of those items are definitely in play. And if you're looking at things just purely on a base of like skill grades, yeah, he belongs in that same conversation.
Yeah, and I'm so glad to be talking to a guy that's been covering USC, because I don't know if it's a classic case of just prospect fatigue, but there's all these just crazy narratives coming about Caleb Williams. And I don't know if you saw the latest one, Greg McElroy. He's saying that he has yet to face any adversity, which I think is just a bunch of hogwash. His first year wasn't even a starter, had to come in the rivalry game of Oklahoma and Texas, balled out, took over the starting position. Then the next year, pops his hammy against Utah in the Pac-12 championship. And then the year after that, they lose 5 games. I wouldn't say it was a major decline in his production, but, it wasn't as productive as the first year. So I want you to kind of touch base on if those narratives are real, and why do you think he did have a dip in production this last year compared to 22 when he won the Heisman?
I think the easiest way to answer that question is to actually start with the dip in production. From a numbers standpoint, yeah, the touchdowns were down, the yards were roughly the same. The thing that really was different, though, that outside observers probably don't either understand or pay respect to, is just how bad that the USC football team was this past season compared to his first year. They had a great crop of transfers that came in Lincoln Riley's first season and really anchored down some really important positions around Caleb Williams, particularly on offense. This was not the same case in his second year. They went out and got some big-time offensive line transfers who never gelled together, some of whom regressed significantly from their previous stops. there weren't the same tools in place for him to succeed. And I think that the more you watch of USC tape, the more obvious it becomes that he was a very, very good player on a very poor, really unimpressive offense. So I think that when you look at the dip in production, you have to look at it more as a dip in overall talent on the team around him. And I think there are definitely some instances in which he tried to overcompensate for that. That Notre Dame game is a good instance. We'll probably talk about that a little bit more later. But specifically with respect to the narratives that have developed around Caleb Williams, it's disappointing because Caleb Williams has done nothing but great things off the field. He runs a foundation, the Caleb Cares Foundation, that has made a really significant impact in the lives of young people in the greater LA area and previously in Oklahoma. Also does a lot of work in Washington, D.C., where he's from. And I think that the prospect fatigue that you brought up puts people in a position where they look for reasons to try and chop down a player like Caleb Williams. And one example that really stands out is the nail painting, specifically the nail painting when they played Utah in the Pac-12 championship game. It was the rematch game. It was the F Utah. And was that in poor taste? Yeah, a little bit. I think that was immaturity. I think he was 20 years old, and that's something that I think every 20-year-old football player in his spot is thinking. And he's confident enough to express that outwardly. Whether he should or not is a different question. But I don't think that the narratives around him being selfish or him being a bad teammate or him not responding well to adversity, I don't think any of those things are founded in truth. And I certainly don't think they're fair. I think if you think about Greg McElroy's criticism specifically, that is ill-informed. There is no way to address that other than to simply say it is ill-informed and clearly with some kind of agenda behind it. Greg McElroy is an excellent analyst. He does a great job calling games in live action for ESPN and ABC. In a situation like that, though, where he's holding court and having a conversation as opposed to reacting to what's happening in front of him, there's always the temptation to try and say something that's simply going to get a reaction, because that's how the media ecosystem kind of works. When people are talking, whether it's good or bad, that's good for the outlet. And I think this is a case of him making a statement that he knew would get a reaction and maybe not recognizing just how inflammatory it is, because there are so many things about Caleb Williams that you can criticize rightfully. And his standing as a teammate and his confrontation with adversity are certainly not two of them. Those are two things that he has had to really earn. And I think that was evident in his transition to USC. There was no immediate transition into this place of power. I mean, obviously, as the quarterback, there's an on-the-field leadership component, but he won those locker rooms because of the person that he is and because of the player that he is, not because he's Lincoln Riley's, golden calf. That's not how football locker rooms work. That's not how big groups of tough people work. You have to earn respect, and that's something that he consistently has done. So I think that the comments by Greg McElroy are a little bit unfortunate, and I think that it, to your point about prospect fatigue, definitely falls in line with that. But as Bears fans, right, if you're thinking about Caleb Williams potentially being your franchise quarterback, I can tell you from firsthand experience of observing him for 2 years and understanding what the dynamics of that football locker room look like, that is not a guy who is selfish, and that is not a guy who doesn't know how to respond to adversity. I mean, there's a great story that Lincoln Riley tells on occasion about how when they were at Oklahoma recruiting Caleb Williams, they decided that they weren't going to take him. They had other ideas. They wanted to go in a different direction. And they told him that. And his response was, I will walk on. I will pay my own way. You don't need to give me a scholarship. I just want to come. I want to develop. And I think what that mentality tells you is that this is a guy who's undeterred. He knows what he wants. He knows that there are ways to accomplish those things. And even a no, right, from the person that he's asking to develop him is not going to stop him from wanting to take that step. And that's something that I think we have to respect as people, not just as sports fans, that he's a guy who really does understand that his willpower goes a long way. And a lot of his mistakes come from that, trying to overcome problematic situations on the field, trying to do too much in difficult situations. I think that all of those things add up to a really excellent teammate with a ton of potential that just needs the right direction.
Yeah, the dude is a competitor. I mean, it's so obvious. You could see it on tape. He's not afraid to go into anywhere and compete. I mean, that story pretty much shows it, proves it. But I'm glad you brought up the Notre Dame game because I feel like as a Bears fan, I could speak for other Bears fans. We're pretty traumatized. So they're trying to find any little reason, any outlet, any game, any bad tape they could find on the guy to make sure to kind of validate that he's not going to succeed at the next level. But, I've read that the Bears actually saw the Notre Dame game as a positive because that is the first time they actually got to see Caleb Williams as a human, not this superhero, not Superman. And reports came out that Notre Dame, they switched up their whole defensive scheme. It was some USC has not seen them play all year or in the seasons past. So I thought Caleb Williams came back in the second half and really bounced back and performed better than he did in the first half. But from your perspective, is that Notre Dame game something that Bears fans should worry about, or what did you see in that game?
I think that game was interesting for a couple of reasons. The first is what you pointed to, that Notre Dame did do a lot of things differently than they'd done previously on film. And their coaching staff and Marcus Freeman deserve a ton of credit for that. That's probably not the last time Caleb Williams is going to run into something like that. So it's very important that he get that experience, despite the fact that at least in that first half, and really only the first half, it did not go well. I will say that from my vantage point as an observer, there were a couple of key pieces to that game. The first being that the lack of offensive line continuity really was on display. Notre Dame capitalized on a fractured and struggling offensive line, and that is not the fault of the quarterback. Yeah, he has a responsibility to take care of the football, but when things crumble in front of you like that, it's difficult to put it on his shoulders in the way that he's not throwing interceptions, in the red zone with 5 seconds left into quadruple coverage. He has players in his face, and that's not to make excuses for him, but if you watch the film of that game specifically, the interceptions, those two pieces, especially the first interception that he throws, it's a very fine line between being an interception and a momentum swing to Notre Dame and a big play that will force Notre Dame to change their defense entirely for the rest of the game. And that was a failure of execution on Caleb's part. He threw off his back foot. The ball was intercepted. It wasn't put exactly where it needed to be. But in an alternate universe where he plants his feet correctly and completes that pass, Notre Dame has to make some really serious adjustments. And I wonder how that would have played out. That game, though, did teach us a lot, and I think reinforced the points we just discussed about his resilience and his, chops as a competitor. Because until Notre Dame returned a kickoff for a touchdown in that game, that was a competitive contest. There was a real possibility that USC could get back and tie things up, potentially force overtime, or even win the game in regulation. There were factors outside of the offense's control and totally outside of Caleb's control that really killed that comeback effort. And, if that kickoff return touchdown doesn't happen and the defense makes a stop, we could be having a very, very different conversation of what the Notre Dame game means to Caleb Williams, right? That could be his big comeback moment, but that's not how it played out. And he's going to have situations that come up like that throughout his professional career, right? Where things outside of his control, be it on special teams or defense, don't go the way he needs them to. But we can't blame him for that. So I think about the Notre Dame game as a very disappointing experience as a Trojan and as a fan. But I don't think I would hold Caleb responsible for why they lost that game. There were definitely some holes in the game plan, and there were some mismatches in personnel, specifically as it pertained to the offensive line, that really made that just a tough matchup for them to win that game. So I wouldn't tell Bears fans to be particularly concerned by it. I wouldn't go all the way to spinning it into a positive. I think that it's a game that every player has between 1 and 5 times in their college career where a lot of things go wrong. They do make some mistakes. And when it all adds up in the end, it looks a lot uglier than it was in real time. So don't think about it too much. There are good things and bad things about it. We can rationalize our way into forgetting about it. We can rationalize our way into thinking it's a positive. I don't think that there's a whole lot that Bears fans need to look at when it comes to the Notre Dame game. Just understand USC wasn't very good, and it really showed on that day.
Yeah, and I keep telling people, bad games are going to happen. It's unfortunate it happened this year, but it was bound to happen. And I really respect how Caleb Williams responded. It's not only in the game, but towards the media. He's a guy that has had all the eyes on him constantly since going to USC. But I want to touch back on why we think he regressed a little bit. And I think it's a big part of Jordan Addison going into the NFL. unfortunately, to a division rival in the Minnesota Vikings, doing great things there. But, I want to talk about two receiver prospects entering the draft this year. If you had to put your money on who would have a better career in the NFL, would you go Brandon Rice or Taj Washington? Because the Chicago Bears, they did recently trade for Keenan Allen, but behind DJ Moore and Keenan Allen, we still need some receivers. And I think it'd be great to pair him with some familiar faces, but there's been arguments just on social media which one would be better for the team or better in the NFL just for longevity. I love Brandon Rice. He has the bloodline from great Hall of Fame Jerry Rice. But I think Taj Washington is a guy that a lot of people are kind of sleeping on. He's explosive. He could play in the slot. You can move him around. He's more than just a gadget player in my eyes. But from those two players, what do you see from them, and who do you think would have a better NFL career?
I think that you're onto something with your feelings on Taj Washington, and I'll start with him. I think Taj Washington is the most underappreciated and underrated receiver to come out of USC in 15 years. And right, USC has become a program that has consistently produced high-level NFL receivers. I mean, you look at Amon-Ra St. Brown, Michael Pittman. These are just a couple of the guys that have really built nice careers for themselves. Jordan Addison being one who only played a year at USC, but already has made a big impact in the NFL. I think Taj Washington is going to have a very good NFL career, regardless of where he ends up. And that's not because of his body. That's not because of his tools. That's because of who he is as a player and who he is as a person. He transferred from Memphis. He earned his spot at USC. He had to really build his way into the rotation over time, and he proved to be extremely reliable. His reliability, though, doesn't just come from having great hands or being excellent after the catch. Those things are true. His reliability comes from his ability to find space in defenses and react once a route is finished, right? Because not every play is going to hit in sequence. Not every timing route is going to materialize in the amount of time it's supposed to, given the structure of the offense. Taj Washington is as good or better than any receiver in this draft at playing after the play, so to speak, is over. I think he's going to have a great NFL career. I think he's going to go probably in the third round. And in 3 to 4 years, we're going to look back and say that guy shouldn't have been a third rounder. I think that's the story that you see with USC receivers. That's not to say that Brendan Rice isn't positioned to also have a very good career. I think the NFL body is certainly there. The physical tools are there. As you mentioned, the bloodlines, right, with his father. I do have concerns about him, though, because he has not been a consistent ball catcher throughout his career, and he doesn't have those same intangibles that Taj Washington does. If I had to pick between the two of them and make a projection of who I think will have the better NFL career, I think it's Taj Washington. I think Brendan Rice is the kind of player that there are 3 to 5 of in every draft. Guys who you look at them and say they passed the eye test, they passed the smell test, all the pieces are there. And of those 3 to 5, maybe one of them hits per year. I think that he might be that one. I don't know. I think it probably depends on his situation, who his quarterback is, what the offensive system is. But as far as players that I wouldn't bet against, I would never bet against Taj Washington. Brendan Rice, I'm less convinced, has the same dynamism to his game to be able to find a home anywhere. He needs the right situation. Taj Washington doesn't. He will make the right situation for himself. And if Bears fans are lucky, maybe it'll be Chicago. I think he'd be a great fit to pair with Caleb Williams, given their history, their ability to work well together off script. I think he's the prospect to be excited about if you see his name show up on draft boards when it comes time.
Yeah, I think Taj Washington would be a great fit, but honestly, I'd be happy to have either of the guys. The Bears need some guys behind Keenan Allen, DJ Moore, and what better than a familiar face that played with Caleb Williams at USC. But I wanted to touch on one more topic before I let you go. Another narrative, I always see clips of, I think it was when they were playing Tulane in the latest bowl game. The backup quarterback comes in, throws 7 touchdowns. A lot of people are wondering how come he had that success coming in on pretty much his first start of the season when Caleb Williams was struggling to throw multiple touchdowns in a game. And there's a viral clip, I'm pretty sure you've seen it, of one of the defenders after a touchdown running and pretty much yelling on the sideline, like, we're a team now, we're a team now. And a lot of people in Chicago are kind of scared that Caleb Williams, lives too much in the spotlight. He's a little big-headed. Did you get that sense at all? And what's the context really behind that guy saying we're a team now?
I think that there's important context, and that's the amount of players on the defensive side of ball, especially who did not play in that bowl game or who were replaced by younger guys, specifically in the secondary. They went and took some chances on a lot of young guys who will be important pieces of the program moving forward. And I think you got to see a lot of guys get their shot where they didn't have it earlier in the year. I think that really is the important context to the "we're a team now" comments. I don't think that that has much of anything to do with the offense, especially not Caleb Williams. That has much more to do with USC's trouble on defense and their total lack of inconsistency. Remember also their defensive coordinator, Alex Grinch, was fired with 2 weeks left in the regular season. So there was a lot of sentiment that had developed about how as long as he is the guy running the show and as long as he is in charge, the defense was never going to be able to be a cohesive unit. There were too many weird things going on. It required too much thought on the part of the defense. I don't know how much you guys as Bears fans are familiar, but basically Alex Grinch was known for such a deep playbook that all of the defenders were required to wear quarterback wristbands. And that's not a good sign, right? If you're running a defense, you want guys to be able to react quickly and get to the ball. And if they're thinking too much about where to be positioned, what their responsibilities are, it's really difficult to have 11 guys in the field who execute their jobs every play. So I think that comment specifically is almost exclusively about the defense. Now, when you look at Miller Moss, who's the backup that came in and threw 7 touchdowns in the Holiday Bowl against Louisville, there are a couple of things that work there. I think that one does relate to Caleb Williams and one does not. Now, maybe two do not. There are 3 pieces. The one that does relate to Caleb Williams is I think that Miller Moss bought into the game plan at a full 150% clip, whereas Caleb Williams always buys into the game plan to a point, but also has so much free reign under Lincoln Riley to change plays with full flexibility. There's so much trust developed between coach and quarterback there that Caleb can change the play whenever he wants and did that quite frequently, potentially to the detriment of the offense. Miller Moss did not have that same flexibility. He came in, he had to follow the game plan, and he did not have the flexibility to change plays in the same way that Caleb Williams does. So I think what we saw was really more reflective of how good of a game caller and game planner Lincoln Riley is than anything else. Caleb Williams probably won't have that issue with the Bears in the NFL because I'd be surprised to see a first-year quarterback have that same kind of freedom to change plays and to manipulate an offense and to make those audibles to the same extent that he did at USC. That is an area of his game that needs to improve. And with coaching, it will. With the right parameters and with the right communication, that will improve. So that's the one area that I think pertains to him. The other aspect, though, is that Louisville is a team from a different conference that, as long as I can remember, has never played USC and does not have any real familiarity there. So, yeah, they're working off of film in the same way that other non-conference teams are. But in the Pac-12, just like is the case in any conference, that familiarity goes a long way towards making life difficult on players who you've seen a lot of times. So you have both a quarterback in Miller Moss who's never played any significant minutes in college football and an opponent that has no real familiarity with USC. And that adds up to suddenly Louisville is discovering a lot of things in real time that they weren't prepared for or they didn't know about. So I don't know that that performance is even illustrative of what's going to happen to USC next season. I think that Miller Moss is going to run into some trouble once the scouting reports start to develop and defenses start to adjust to what he does and get a better idea of who he is. So I think he really capitalized on an opportunity where there was very little known about him. You can't say the same about Caleb Williams, right? He's played so much football that every opponent has 35, 40 games of film to work off of. And there's very little you can hide when there's that much film. So I don't know that if you put Caleb Williams in the same situation, he has that kind of performance. He probably doesn't, to be perfectly honest with you. But I don't think that there's a reason for concern. I don't think that that's something to say, hey, USC was better without Caleb Williams. That's not true. USC's offense did perform at a very high level in one game without Caleb Williams. And the reasons for that go in a couple of different directions. But as far as Bears fans should be concerned, I don't think that there's much you can learn from the Holiday Bowl other than, one, college football is weird, and two, it matters a lot once there's film on a guy, because if there isn't, he has a lot more flexibility to surprise an opponent, and that's what we saw from Miller Moss.
Yeah, so I want to touch on a point that you made. They changed the offense for Miller Moss, and a big knock on Caleb Williams has that he plays too much hero ball. You know, he doesn't play in structure enough. his whole pro day was scheduled around him just playing in structure. And I've heard things about Lincoln Riley's offense that maybe the air raid doesn't transfer as well to the pro level. Do you see any problems with that? And do you see any hiccup that Caleb Williams might go through going to the NFL, playing more so in structure?
I don't think it's going to be a huge learning curve for him. I think that the biggest change will be how much freedom he has. And he's always going to have freedom within a play, right? To kind of go that hero ball route and to do what he does so well. And that's part of what makes him such a great prospect, right? It's the improvisation. So don't confuse yourself into thinking that, hey, he does too much of this, it's a bad thing, we don't want it. It's a great thing when it works well. The bigger problems with USC and why I think he took too much responsibility on himself is that there were a lot of situations where they found themselves in 3rd and 9, 3rd and 8, 3rd and 13. And the reasons for that were a running game that was pretty anemic for a lot of the season. I think Caleb did make some mistakes in checking plays that may have worked had they been left as called into things that he thought might work in the moment instead. Those are not going to be issues that Bears fans need to worry about because he's not going to have the same level of freedom to make it the Caleb offense. And I say the Caleb offense, not because he's not following the play. He's changing plays, very different from not following through progressions. He's actually really, really good at working through his progressions. I think there's a lot of film that supports that. And he does a great job getting from 1, 2 to 3, and occasionally to 4. So I don't think that he's going to struggle in structure. I think the biggest learning curve for him is going to be how he builds a relationship with a different coach and a different coaching staff, because there was so much trust built between Caleb Williams and Lincoln Riley that he basically had carte blanche to do whatever he thought was right in the moment. It'll be good for him to not have that same level of freedom, especially against NFL defenses that are more complicated, more sophisticated. But I think he'll adjust to that well because he is extremely smart. He's very smart and he has the tools to be able to operate within structure and then improvise where it's appropriate. I think that that's an area that fans should actually be really excited about. The fact that he's not going to have his college coach with him. He's not going to be in a familiar system. He has to relearn things. And because he has to relearn things, I think he's going to be more willing and more interested in following the script as it's written until he really understands it. I think you might not see him really unleash what his best skills are until year 2 or year 3. If he really does follow through into his first season with the mentality of I want to learn, I want to get this all figured out, and I want to build the trust, I think you'll see a lot more of Caleb in structure, maybe to the point that it becomes frustrating. I could see a universe in which Caleb Williams is so committed to following through on play calls and running the offense as it's designed that he perhaps does undercut his ability to improvise a little bit. I could see that happening. Hopefully it doesn't, because he's at his most exciting. He's the best for football when he's playing with those skills that make him so special. But I don't think that's something to worry about. I think that it has much more to do with the relationship he built with Lincoln Riley and perhaps Lincoln Riley trusting him too much than it does anything else.
Yeah, and I really can't wait to see Caleb Williams work with Shane Waldron. They do have history working together at the QB Collective, and the Chicago Bears are a running football team. So I can't wait to see Caleb Williams with a run game and, a decent defense. But, before I let you go, I just want to know, is there any prospects that we should watch out for on the USC football team coming up next year? Because, number one, Branch, every time I watch tape on this dude, this guy's explosive. He's flying all over the field. Is he a guy to watch? Or if not him, who is somebody to watch?
Yeah, I mean, you nailed the guy, Zach Branch. He is a special player because of the things he does that are unteachable. He's a small guy, but he's built. He's strong. He's not going to be fragile in the same way that a lot of those smaller, Tavon Austin style guys can be. I think it's going to be exciting to see how he develops from year 1 to year 2, because you could see he was already an elite college player as a returner, right? That explosiveness, that shiftiness, all those things were in play in the return game. But getting him really involved in the offense was a little bit more challenging. I think he is primed to have a great sophomore season. I think he's a guy that all NFL fans should kind of have, out the corner of their eye for the next 2 years. I'm curious to see on the defensive side of the ball, how Bear Alexander develops. There was a bit of a saga that kind of developed where he was supposedly going to enter the transfer portal this week, and then the NIL collective came back and raised their offer. So now he's staying at USC, but he started his career at Georgia. He's a defensive tackle who is more often than not unblockable, and the kind of game changer on that side of the ball that every team needs every year. And there are not enough elite defensive linemen to go around. So it might sound funny saying that there's a defensive prospect from USC that fans should be keeping their eyes on. But this is a guy who I think their defense is going to have a pretty significant turnaround this year. And he's going to be a massive reason why. It's going to be his draft year. So if you're looking ahead to next season, keep your eyes and ears out for Bear Alexander, because he's the best defensive lineman USC's had since Leonard Williams, bar none. And we all know how Leonard Williams has worked out in the NFL. He's been a great player who has made a huge impact in multiple stops. And Bear Alexander has all the tools to be that same kind of guy.
Cool, man. Well, Cooper, I know you're a busy guy, man, so I'll let you go. But thank you for joining me on this week's episode of Believe in Bears podcast. You gave myself and every Bears fan's great insight on Caleb Williams and what's to come, man. So follow my guy Cooper for anything USC related or anything football related. Thank you, Cooper.
Sky, appreciate you, man. You have a good one. Pleasure coming on the show.
You too, brother.